So I want to welcome everybody to the State of the Reactors. We're going to try to do these community calls more often, just to let everybody know that there's a massive team behind Tokemak, and we're all working really hard and give you some more transparency on updates and just improve comms at large. So we're excited to get these going. And again, thanks to Dan for helping push the initiative. And with that, I will kick it over to the liquidity wizard.
Cool. Thanks, End. So welcome to, I guess, the first in the new series here of Tokemak community calls. So I think during bear markets, it's going to be important for us to step up our communications game. So we're going to be doing this a lot more frequently. In fact, to that end, maybe I'll throw it over to Bruno here to sort of kick things off with what our updated sort of call cadence will be for the community. Bruno, you want to share the kind of timing on those things?
Yeah, so this will consist of like basically two types of calls. We're gonna have like the captain's call. We call it the Capcom. I'm gonna do this weekly we have the first one scheduled for today, so this will be Thursdays. And then for the community at large, we were going to do these bi-weekly. The schedule is like to come out like imminently. We haven't set it yet, as you've probably noticed, but I think it will look like we're gonna hold these calls on Fridays.
So this will be sort of the odd one out today, or we're doing
this one's the odd one out. But going forward, I think it's going to be the Fridays, and you'll see these scheduled also like on Discord very soon.
Yep. So keep watching for that. So the plan would be sort of 2 weeks from tomorrow will be the next one, and then we'll just be doing them bi-weekly, so every other week after that. And that'll be to try to keep everyone more up to date on progress, all the things we're building, and just have you be more plugged in with the team here, because I think right now we probably can do a better job increasing our comms to everyone.
Yeah. And something that I might add here is that Dan set up a Notion board that is like public, so community members can put their questions in there, or like thoughts, ideas of things that they would like to see covered during these calls. We are, as always, like keeping an eye on Discord and seeing like what like the questions are, like what's trending, but it's often like difficult to like really keep track of it. So it would be great if people would also like centrally use this to have like a spot where we can like easily reference questions and like see these things.
And Dan, if you want to drop that link again in the State of the Reactors chat, that could be good.
Yeah, I was just about to mention that there's a new State of the Reactor chat that you guys can all chat in during this call, and I think if we have some time at the end for questions, we can take them from that channel as well. But I'll drop the link to the Notion board now.
Awesome. So I think given all that, let me sort of kick it off with what our overall agenda is for this first one here. So I'm going to start with sort of a status update on the protocol, cover the health. Then we're going to go into some updates on a number of the different things that we're building. We've got some of our lead devs on stage with us, so we'll probably throw it over to them to say a thing or two about sort of in the trenches what they're working on sort of this week, next week, tactically. And then we'll run through. There's been a lot of, you can see in the audience, number of people that have fielded some good questions into the core team. We're going to go through quite a bit of those questions that the team has sort of amassed, and that should probably take up the bulk of the time. And then at the end, as DJ and Dan was saying, we can probably pull up a few questions from the sort of that pop up in those chats. So I think with that, let's kind of dig in, and everyone on stage, feel free to chime in with any color on any of the pieces that we sort of cover as we go, because we'll be covering quite a bit today. Okay, so let's start with the kind of the status of the protocol. So the sort of top-down answer is that Tokemak is in a very safe and healthy state, regardless of what the crypto and DeFi market is, and regardless of any prices, Toka and otherwise across the space might tell you. So the protocol owns almost $31 million in protocol-owned assets. So our treasury is about $31 million. We have almost 74% of that in stables. So of the $31 million that the protocol owns, there's about $23 million in stables, and this is predominantly USDC with a bit of DAI. So USDC and DAI, we're not in the mode right now of not taking risks into to others, even though there's a number of stablecoin projects that we very much are partners with and support. One thing that can be shared maybe after the call, Bruno can probably share the Dune Analytics link. I think a lot of you on this call probably haven't looked at the dashboard before, but we have a dashboard where you can see all of this, both the deployments as well as sort of a live state of our treasury, and you'll be able to see the 31 million and the 23 million in stables right there. Some other sort of, I'll say, health updates throughout this insane market cycle since beginning of May. Tokemak has been able to not only manage, but without any change to operations, hand back all withdrawal requests from liquidity providers and liquidity directors without incident and without issue. And it's our entire belief and goal to always have that be the case through all markets. And we're in a very healthy state there. I think that's probably something that most protocols and for sure centralized groups, as you're watching through the bloodbath right now in the space, cannot say. So we're very proud of that, and we'll continue to do so. One sort of update on the team side, which I think a lot of people probably don't know of Tokemak. You probably see now how many people are on stage, but I think since we probably haven't been as talkative as some groups are in the space, maybe more talkative than some, but not as talkative as some groups, at least in sort of community calls, and we're changing that. A lot of people don't know how big the team is. So we have about 20 full-time core team members that are building, and I'll say putting in a lot more than full-time hours. And we have numerous contributors that are working part-time too, beyond that sort of 20 core team. And you're seeing a number of the core team on stage here, but there's significant more that are probably right now writing code. Even given that relatively large team size, the fact that we have a treasury of 31 million and 23 million in stables that are not even at risk of market moves, we have 4 to 5 years of runway. So the important thing here is Tokemak's not going anywhere other than building, and we can build through any market, anything the markets will throw at ourselves. We are completely here and ensuring that we are building the future of liquidity bandwidth for DeFi and Web3. And all of us remain as convicted as ever in what we're building, why we're building it, and the sort of future of DeFi and Web3. So that's kind of an update across the board on sort of status and health of the protocol. I'm going to dig into a little bit on some of the things that we're building right now. So the big thing that most of us are heads down on is building out the ACC model, which is really part of sort of Tokemak V2 or a V2 model of Tokemak. Without going into way too many details, you can see one ACC article we pushed out, which is admittedly very heavy on the math side. We're going to put out more things that are very, what's the right word, digestible, as opposed to that sort of deep dive in the near future. But the ACC model is basically going to enable token locking, among other things. So what this is going to do is going to allow us to decrease circulating supply, because you will now have the ability for token holders to lock their token. It's going to enable us to, with other parts of Tokemak V2, get us to profitable only liquidity deployments, which is going to enable sustainable emissions. So effectively what we're focused on right now is having the revenues exceed our emissions. And what that will enable us to do is actually use a portion of the revenues to purchase the token that then is emitted, instead of having to do net new emissions. And additionally, going to this ACC model or Tokemak V2 is going to ensure that we can drive organic DeFi protocol demand across DeFi and Web3 for Toka. So one of the biggest things right now is obviously retail within DeFi is temporarily muted. I don't think that will last forever or for too long, but in that case, you need to make your protocol more useful to the other protocols. And if you're useful to them, think sort of a convex curve type situation, then there's a lot more sort of latent or organic demand for the protocol and for the token. Update on the Core 3 side, because obviously we had that event, which was right around when the market started to, the market around us started to implode. The Core 3 event went well. We obviously had 5 new reactors that were voted on. We have been going around talking to all those different groups, so a lot of things moving on the business side there. We're going to get to that shortly when we run into some questions, and I'll probably have Craig do some updates on that end. On the Exaverse side, which we haven't given you an update in a little while, we have some, I think, interesting updates today, and we're going to have a much more thorough update in 2 weeks at the next community call. So I'd like to acknowledge that I think Exaverse probably has taken longer than what a lot of people were maybe thinking or hoping for. And the key reason for that is when we first were building Exaverse, we thought this is sort of a game type wrapper to drive demand to Tokemak. And while that's still true, we have now built something much more innovative than a game, and we'll be able to share more on that very soon. But because we've found something that's a lot more innovative than just trying to go build a game and compete with other game attention for players that are going to other games, this takes a bit longer. That said, I can tell you that next week there's going to be some deployments to testnet for Exaverse, and that the following week, Internet Paul will be on stage with us as well as End here to give some more updates on the project and also talk a little bit on sort of launch timing and expectations on that front. Other few things just on what we're building or some recent updates. A number of you have probably seen that governance recently launched. So we now have Snapshot Live. You're going to see more proposals in the near future along that side, and we want to have the community a lot more plugged in with along with the core team on sort of driving where this protocol goes next. And we're going to be standing up forum as well so that we can have good open discussions pre-snapshot votes. And as a result of that first vote, which was nearly unanimous, I think other than like 100 Toka or something, we have a foundation that has been established as of this week, which will support the Tokemak DAO and is going to make sure that we're able to do all of the things that we need to do to sort of drive forward liquidity bandwidth in the future. And I think some of you may have joined the call last Sunday where Bruno and Mike, I believe, were on that call to discuss sort of what the foundation enables us to do. So I think with that, that's sort of the main updates on status and building. Anyone on the stage can feel free to chime in any other things I've missed, but also maybe I'll throw it over to Cody, our lead architect, to talk just a bit on kind of like this week, next week, how these couple of weeks look in terms of what the dev team is heads down working in.
Yeah, absolutely. So development in the coming weeks and going on right now, we are focusing on ACC Toke. So doing some prep work there, making sure that we have efficient movement from, let's say, current staking into ACC Toke, so that for everyone that wants to, they can get in as quick and easy as possible, and as well as building out the rest of that contract. So that has started and is going great. We are doing some kind of technical feasibility, looking at new AMMs, looking at Balancer, V2, FracSwap, Maverick, and just kind of looking at again, the feasibility of getting them integrated. Looking at the kind of longer term, but an overhaul of our liquidity deployments, making it more efficient, making sure that we can move funds around in kind of a nice atomic fashion. Again, keeping it as efficient as possible. That is a longer term project, but is one that is necessary. So you'll probably hear that one come up a lot, but is ongoing and making good progress. From a non-contract side, just looking at our monitoring, we've been adding some additional just market monitoring, as well as infrastructure DNS monitoring. So I think that probably wraps it up.
Awesome, thanks. And I wanted to give you kind of an insight into more of the tactical things. I'm often super top down, just talking at a project level. So that's what Cody and Sam and a number of the other devs on our team are heads down working on right now. So I think with that, let's jump into sort of the next phase, which is going to be focused on a number of questions that have come up within Discord from various members in the community. We've captured, I think, most of them are the ones that are coming up the most. And so we're going to just kind of run down these in sort of no particular order. So one of the first ones that has come up is question on kind of the Core 3 Reactor spin up in terms of estimated time for this and sort of where we're at on that. The short answer here, and then I'm going to throw it over to Craig, is that we're underway. We've been discussing with multiple of the groups. I think we've hit at least 3 of the 5 where we're talking with them and getting it into their governance flow. But maybe I'll throw that over to Craig, and he can give an update on Core 3 reactors.
Yeah, sounds good. Hello, everybody. Welcome to State of the Reactors. As Carson said, we've been working hard on the Core 3 reactor ignition. And this is one of the things that has maybe taken a little bit longer is we're moving in the direction of what we've called permissionless reactors or decentralized reactors. And this is really kind of a self-service model where we put the power of creating great liquidity into the hands of the DAOs themselves. And through that process, it's taken some time for us to kind of formalize what we think an appropriate model is to present to the DAOs. And then now we're collaborating with the DAOs directly on this new model. And I think there's a lot of excitement here. This will establish those first few pieces that continues to let us open up reactor ignition to DAOs and in this more permissionless manner. So all that's going well. One of the key pieces for this is the reactor ignition or the collateralization of the reactor, which we in some of our old language, but now it's providing the reserve is sort of the key step one and doesn't require a token swap, which really was not a sustainable path, but it was an easy way to launch the first reactors. In this new model, DAOs themselves are able to decide on providing a reserve, and there's some key mechanics that go into that. And once that reserve is provided, we're able to spin up a reactor pretty quickly. So what you should see over the coming weeks are a few governance proposals in our Core 3 reactor winners governance forums. And hopefully those all continue to move forward in an efficient way. And hopefully those reactors will be spinning up before too long.
Great. And I would say maybe one more thing, Craig kind of hit on this, but from a tech perspective, I think, to outsiders, you probably see the core event complete, and then it's like, why aren't these just sort of turned on right away? And from a tech perspective, they could be like the day after a core vote, all reactors could be spun on. The reason that it takes a bit of time is because it's much more of a business BD. And I know CJ and Craig on this call have been working hard networking with all these groups. It generally has to go to a governance vote for them in order to establish both the reserve needed to protect the IL for the reactor, and then additionally, they have to make sure that the core team of a project is ready to have more liquidity, which generally there are, but there can be cases where they actually want to push out several months, which we've seen at least once in the past. So that's sort of one of the reasons that when you see this, it isn't sort of a fast process. It's working through sort of DAO-to-DAO discussions and making sure everyone's ready to go. So I think yeah, go ahead.
I would just even add on some circumstances, some DAOs might not want to immediately increase their liquidity due to also market conditions. And all of these idiosyncrasies imply that this is a case-by-case scenario, and in some cases, it just takes longer to set up some of these reactors.
Yep, exactly. So staying on the topic of Core for a minute, one of the other next questions was Core 4 event. So is this going to happen? We've mentioned in the past that, especially going into Core 3, that we were planning Core 3, Core 4. Then on some other calls, we were like, well, is Core 4 going to happen? So the reason for sort of the, I'll say, pause or question is really that the current level of DeFi, there's obviously current sort of muted participation. And so when we were going into Core 3, we thought, okay, we'll do these back to back pretty rapidly. And the week of Core 3, I believe, was the week started the end of April going into May. And of course, the first week of May is when everything crashed. So that's the reason for sort of not a rapid back to back. Now, what we want to do is make sure that we have the Core 3 reactors spun up before we would do Core 4. We've been discussing the pros and cons sort of internally of doing Core 4 versus going directly to decentralized reactor spin up. I think the consensus within the team currently is that we will do Core 4. It's just a question of sort of date and timing. And I think along those ends, we just want to make sure that we do it at a moment that DeFi is ready to plug into a Core 4 event. So we will keep you updated on that, but that's sort of it's really kind of a macro backdrop reason that you didn't hear more about Core 4 right out of Core 3. Next on the decentralized Reactor spin-up, which Craig gave some kind of an overview on too. We long called permissionless reactors. Now we're calling them decentralized reactors. Core 3 spin-up is actually using, and Craig mentioned this, some of the mechanics we'll be using for permissionless reactors. So in the past, we had to use precious Toka for Core 1, Core 2 to swap with a project in order to establish our in-house reserve, which ultimately sits in our protocol-owned assets in order to turn on the reactor and be able to protect the LPs into Tokemak. With Core 3 and talking with the different projects, we actually aren't doing a swap, which is great because it preserves precious Toka, and it also means that we don't have to go through quite as lengthy of a governance process, probably on both sides, for sort of approving those things. That is very much the building blocks for how permissionless Reactor spin-up will work. So there is, I would say in general, to get to permissionless Reactor spin-up or decentralized Reactor spin-up, it was a more complex undertaking, I would say, than it appears on surface level, and probably that we thought at first. We want to make sure we get this right because this impacts the health and security of the protocol. So if we don't have the establishment of turning on a new reactor for ABC project right, one could launch with the wrong volatility parameters, and then that could put the Toka stakers to that specific reactor at risk. So it's very important that we get these mechanics right, and that's sort of why this took a little bit of, or is taking a bit of time. And importantly, the ACC Toka mechanics, really part of Tokemak v2, are frankly more important for the protocol and for driving value back to Toka holders. So decentralized Reactor spin-up coming, but additionally, we always have to have the paired asset, meaning you have to have the ETH or the stable to pair with a governance token. And so if you get to decentralized Reactor spin-up, you want to make sure that you can sort of stomach it with enough of the TVL on the other side, and you want to sort of scale into it. So that's kind of the update on that end. Anything on our end on permissionless reactors before we jump up to the next one? Okay.
I think that's all. Sounds good too.
Cool. Okay, so next, questions on revenue decline in the space, and I'll give some numbers on that, and then I'll probably throw it over to Sterling. So if you compare our revenue that the protocol was generating in, say, April to now, it's a large decline, and there's very good reason for that. So if you go back to sort of April timeframe, pre the market crash, we were earning around 500K a week, or a little under 500K a week. And it varied, so 300 to 500, say. These were in things like CRV, CVX, 3Curve, Sushi. And now we're still generating around 80 to 100K per week, even in this bear market. And the most direct reason is as the market has sold off across all of DeFi, and most DeFi tokens are down 85 to 99%, which is significant. But I should say, for any of you that haven't sort of scrolled back, this is not without precedent. Very interesting one to look at is MKR, which sold off a similar amount and then came back to all-time highs as soon as the markets flipped over. But as we're pulling in quantities of, say, CRV and CVX, and as they're massively sold off, the value of that, obviously in dollar amounts, is much smaller. So the fact that you have most of these tokens selling off to that level, and that we're still able to pull in around 20% or so of the revenue kind of before the market crashed, is a very good sign. And again, maybe two other things to note here is that we have things in a very sort of safe mode right now, meaning we are not risk on in our deployments. We're making sure that that Tokemak builds and sets up all the things to thrive and really own the liquidity market going forward. But we're not being as aggressive as we can at the moment in generating revenue at the expense of safety and stability of the protocol. So the fact that we're still pulling in 20% revenue, which is 100K a week, 80 to 100K a week, is actually quite strong. And I should note that when I said 4 to 5 years runway earlier on the call on our about $32 million treasury, that was assuming zero revenue. So that was assuming that we were just draining the treasury as we build, which of course we're not. We're generating revenue, and that can offset we will soon get to where that can offset more than all of our expenses. So I think more on an operational or space side, maybe I'll throw this over to Sterling, and he can talk a little more on the kind of market and risk side of things and on revenue decline.
On the revenue decline side, there's something that is not accounted on the numbers that you provided, which is the trading fees. So that's just on the reward token side. So obviously we're going to see an impact on the reward token side because we saw a compression of yields due to the decrease in the price of the denomination of those yields. So for example, CRV, CVX, and 3CRV. But another thing that I wanted to touch on is the strategic importance of those rewards. So again, we published our convex and curve strategy. I'm going to touch on that later on to just explain how that impacts Tokemak's inflation in the future. And I think that we have some news that the community isn't aware of. And something that we are very much focused on, it's sustainability at the protocol level. So making sure that, for example, with things like revenue modulation, we are not paying more than what we are internalizing for the protocol in terms of revenue. And on the risk profile side, this is something that we need to be aware, and I'll emphasize, which is there are times when we should increase the risk profile, times when we should decrease them. And Tokemak has been very conservative with its liquidity multiplier, right? And that's something that was a great decision throughout this whole downturn. And there will be a time when we will increase our risk profile and start to increase our liquidity multiplier, because increasing revenue, it's pretty easy. You just need to deploy more liquidity, but you can't do that at the expense of protocol security. So on that, I just congratulate the whole team because we were very careful and we are able to not be too exposed to this market downturn. And eventually, when the reversal happens, we will start to increase this risk profile.
Awesome. Yep. Good overview.
And I also wanted to add that, like a lot of these rewards that we generated, they were like generated in pools that were like from, risk perspective, they were like pretty vanilla. But currently there's there's like kind of this unknown contagion currently in DeFi. So we've gone pretty risk off in these. That being said, though, we have identified a couple of options that would more like match our current like kind of risk appetite. So people could expect us to like the system to like soonish deploy once we have like finalized like the assessment of these options. That being said, like the revenue on those will not be like sky high like we've seen like earlier this year due to like the market currently. But it will definitely get the revenue going a little bit more again.
It's also important to mention that these deployments are also a function of the reserves. And if we want to be extra cautious with the treasury funds, then we need to also shrink those deployments because we are not willing to risk those reserves, because the priority is always that the LP funds are never at risk. And to do so, we use the reserve system. And as it stands, again, it's a risk-off environment. Thus, we need to keep building and preparing for the next phase.
Yep. Well said. So next question is sort of when the new tokenomics or when ACC Toka, and I'll say when Tokemak V2, as we're starting to call it internally for all of these changes, because it's beyond just ACC Toka, has a lot to do with going to sustainable emissions and profitable liquidity deployments. So recently we have introduced some updated reward mechanics that are a key sort of first step for this, where that we can have revenue modulation based on individual reactors and sort of their profitability to Tokemak and therefore to the Toka holders. This is working as expected, which is great. And there's going to be some tweaks that we'll make to them going forward. But I would say the experiment has been a success so far on that at an operational level. And right now, as Cody had mentioned earlier, the dev team is working on a lot of the staking contracts, the architecture, et cetera. All of these things end up still needing to go through audits and everything. So just to give sort of a rough timeline expectation, we're looking at up to 3 months, something like that. And a lot of that comes from the delay due to audits. So probably about a month worth of writing the code, then going through the audits, deployments, testing, all of that stuff. Anything to say on our side, or this might be a good link to some of the other things? Anyone on the call?
Yeah, I was actually going to interrupt you, Carson, and say that I was going to hijack this part because I think that the buyback question is highly plugged into this topic, right? And what makes sense is to perform a buyback that is, first of all, non-inflationary, right? So we are very eager to just plug in the revenue factor and support token markets. And what this implies is that the buybacks will be intrinsically connected with the ACC token model, and they can kind of be seen as one single topic here.
Yep. Totally
And
agree.
I also wanted to add something here. So the question of like, the timing on ACC and like potential like kind of delays that we had there, what also needs to be considered is that like these like kind of pieces that you plug into like a protocol or like these new tokenomics, they always like affect, the entire tokenomics of the entire system, right? So there's often you have to like, or like you consider like second order effects like that could affect like the protocol like on a completely different level than the obvious. So there's often you hit the point where you kind of have to reiterate or like find a new way to like do something. And this often leads to like, smaller delays or like problems that you have to work through that are like just unexpected, right? And ultimately, right, it's a question of like getting these things right. So, I will always like personally, I will always tend to rather delay something a little bit than just like, push something out just to like hit some timeline, right? And then put funds at risk by doing that. Yeah.
Yep. And maybe two more questions that we can go through sort of relatively back to back related to timelines. So next one will be WhenBrain. So the answer with that one is the Membrane team has been working very hard and now has a pro product that is out and already on some trading desks and is getting very good feedback from all of that. There is going to be a DeFi product that will be non-KYC and anyone can use that's coming, and there's still going to be the Brain token. Right now is just not the time, frankly, to launch a token. This market will not support sort of the launch. That's going to change, but this was originally supposed to be sort of around our timing, I would say, now for the next 3 months. And if you talk to projects, VCs across the space, everyone is sort of delaying token launch right now by several months because, again, DeFi, the DeFi background, you can see it even with Tokemak, right, where our circulating supply is trading below, circulating supply market cap is trading below our book value, which is normally called arbitrage in regular functioning markets, but no one's focused on fundamentals. No one's focused on sort of your actual strategy and what you can provide in the space. No one is focused on new tokens coming out. And so we will pause on launching the token until the market can stomach a token, which it definitely will be. This is all going to be transient as we look back on it, but now is not a good moment to launch the token. Toka stakers are still going to be happy. So the Tokemak community is still going to be happy once Brain comes, and you'll be much happier if it launches at a moment when there can be price discovery the correct way, hopefully, instead of the current market. Next, just kind of
if you don't mind, I would just go back to the previous question because I recall seeing some time ago a question on Discord regarding ACC token. So the question was essentially why would we choose to distribute that revenue in token instead of distributing in the native tokens? And this is a very important question because essentially, if we were to distribute that revenue in the native tokens, we would just fragment the gas costs through multiple different tokens that essentially would undermine the end user claiming all of those different tokens and then compounding them. So we get this dual reward effect where Tokemak assumes the costs of those of that compounding process, right? And at the same time, we are supporting token markets with those buybacks. But it's important to understand how fragmented this is because the reward tokens and the trading fees, they are denominated in a series of different assets. So for the end user, similar to, for example, what you see on Votium, it would just be highly costly to claim them individually.
Mm-hmm. Yep, great points. And then just jumping kind of more general to sort of timeline, expectation settings, and sort of delays in general. I think the most important thing to note here is that DeFi is a very, very quickly or rapidly changing ecosystem. So I think having these biweekly calls is going to make it a lot easier to sort of set expectations and keep everyone up to speed on progress. I would say, especially with the sell-off recently, it's caused everyone in DeFi to sort of say, okay, what exactly does our timeline look like? Do we reprioritize certain things? And for us, that meant very much doubling down on the ACC Toka or Tokemak V2 model, which is going to make our protocol sustainable in every way. And that, I think, is going to be the key in sort of the next phase of DeFi. Like, anyone can attract TVL if you pay enough in emissions. That's what everyone, and in a lot of ways, Tokemak included, was doing in the last phase, the bull market, right? It's a new moment. We need to be focused on protocol-owned asset, basically our balance sheet. We need to be focused on revenue, new and really profitable revenue as quickly as possible, and on growing those protocol-owned assets that ultimately all of the native token holders hold and ultimately own. Anything on kind of our side, kind of more broadly on this, I would say probably one of our maybe cardinal sins is that we like to throw out times, and a lot of projects just don't announce anything until it's out there. So I think that's something we can probably get a better balance to as we're having more frequent communications here, where we can just get people sort of updated on progress as opposed to giving specific dates that can move up front or front or back.
The transparency of also sharing the struggles that we face with all of these obstacles also provides some more answers, right? And instead of being just soon, people understand, well, what's the current blocker, and that's very helpful. And with regard to the TVL, as we said, like, there is a time to increase our risk profile. Right now, that's not the time, because even in terms of opportunities, it's not like the risk reward is just not there, right? So it doesn't make sense to attract the required TVL, because if we don't feel comfortable safely deploying it, then it would just be a waste of rewards. And again, with pieces like revenue modulation, we are aligning more and more emissions and revenue, and that's something to look forward to.
Yep, kind of the measure twice, cut once scenario. And I think the question came up too about like sort of what's a confidence interval on various timelines. So I would say, for like, as an example, for ACC Toka, launching within 3 months, and I would actually say 2 to 3 months, but let's say within 3 months, 85% about for confidence. It's quite high within the team. We feel good about all the stuff we're building. We're working through sort of business logic that goes into parameters more than anything within a lot of this. We know what we're building out from a tech side, a tech perspective quite well. And I might go slightly out of order from here, because I think the kind of along this line, sort of on timelining of thing, there's the question of kind of sort of new L1 and L2 integrations, which we've kind of long been talking about. And so this kind of links into that. And one of the biggest things, we did a study of what tokens or liquidity is supported on the other L2s that are available, or L1s. And the answer was that it really didn't make sense. So before we could before we had looked at this, we were thinking, okay, as everyone was thinking about sort of L2 22 and how to get to multiple L2s, right? In a bygone day, which will come back at some point. But we were excited about this. We then looked at the reactors that we had, and we realized it was pretty much TCR and SNX liquidity that we could actually port to any of the relevant chains that we wanted to go to. So a lot of these tokens, like if you go to other chains, you're just limited by what tokens are available there, what liquidity pools are available there, or that we could establish there. And so that was one big consideration. Now, the more important consideration is what you really want to do is get your model right and then start exporting it places. So there's no real point in us exporting Tokemak V2, or sorry, Tokemak V1 when we're working so hard on Tokemak V2. We need to get that right on Ethereum, and then we can propagate the V2 model across all these things. But there's no real point in pushing over Tokemak V1 when we have all of this ACC Toka profitable liquidity and sustainable emission mechanics that we're building out. We want to get that right and then start branching out. Anything else on that point? Yeah.
I would just add that there is a very big difference from the technical deployment to one of these layer 2s, for example, and the product market fit. So the main focus while assessing what are the desirable chains to deploy to, it's this overlap between current reactors and liquidity present on those layer 2s, for example. And something that I've been also very focused on, it's thinking, okay, so if our purpose is to make markets, we need to have markets to deploy that liquidity to. And that has been one of the major constraints. It's simply the lack of demand on those layer 2s for Tokemak's current set of reactors.
Okay, next question is on Toka buybacks, and sort of that this, we talked about this early on, and we had it in place for a bit early on. This has now been sort of rebranded, or I won't even say rebranded. It will come in a different form as a subset of the ACC Toka model. So I'll maybe let's see, who do we want to have talk on this? We don't actually have them up. I'm going to have Sterling go ahead and talk, I guess, on this for kind of the general buyback approach. And then I'll kind of link it back to our plan with ACC Toka, where everything is going to be all focused on profitable purchases of Toka, but as a subset, not as sort of the main focus of buybacks.
Personally, this is kind of reiterating also part of what we have previously discussed, but I think that buybacks need to have a strategic purpose, right? And it doesn't make sense, especially with the current market environment, to deplete treasury funds to just pump the price. I'm against that. So what makes sense is to incorporate this in our new tokenomics through the ACC model and just support those token buybacks with system revenue. And so again, as I previously mentioned, this is going to be in the form of trading fees, reward tokens that will be reconverted on the percentage that is going to be allocated for the revenue distribution. And that's going to support, again, token prices. So you get this dual effect of distributing revenue and at the same time supporting and providing value to token holders.
Yep, and just layering a little bit further on what Sterling was saying. So Tokemak V2 is not only going to have the ability to lock Toka, but also you'll be able to, we will be able to then sort of emit locked Toka as our rewards instead of just unlocked, and that locked Toka can always be purchased via a subset of the revenue that's generated. So this is what we mean by getting to sustainable emissions and profitable liquidity deployments. We just want to make sure that revenue can outpace our emissions. We can run this profitably. And then within that model, you can actually unlock a sort of a sustainable buyback program, which really isn't even called a buyback program. It's really just a subset of the ACC token model. And you can see other protocols that have done this successfully. Anytime if you can have emissions under the revenue you're generating, it makes a lot of sense to use secondary market purchases as opposed to net new emissions from the treasury or from the DAO. Okay, so yep, go ahead.
It would be also a good time to explain what do we do with these rewards, right? There is a strategic purpose for these rewards. And that strategic purpose is also to decrease our inflation. So when we designed the convex and curve strategy...
Sterling, I think we might have lost you there.
Can you guys hear me now?
Yep, now we got you.
Okay, so I'm not sure what part did you listen to, but I was touching on the strategic importance of these rewards, right? And how we were focused with the convex and curve strategy to slowly replace our own pool 2. So something that I'm not sure if everyone on this call is aware of is that we have recently secured our Tokeeth gauge on Curve V2. And with the current gauge weight vote that we performed, we are currently having an APR on that pool that is around 133% on the max range. So on convex, obviously with a boost factor of something like 1.75, I think, the APR should be around 115%, if my math is right. And this is only the start. So that was the initial Kickstarter of the convex and curve strategy. And now it comes into play the stake val liquid lockers. So instead of converting part of their strategy to CVX CRV, we can use part of that strategy to convert it directly to SDCRV. So per week, this represents immediately an increase of like 300%, if I recall correctly, of more governance power over curve. And by my estimate, within 3 to 4 months, we are in a good condition to start to deprecate the previous model that we had. And again, with our CVX CRV component, we also have a sustained cash flow that is going to support this model. And later on, we will introduce probably also the Quest side. So from Paladin, currently there is a large arbitrage for protocol-owned liquidity. So essentially, on Quest, you can basically double your investment, taking into consideration how much you pay with your reward token versus how much you are acquiring with your own liquidity farming. And this is all going to plug back into the same model of supporting Tokemak's liquidity in a non-inflationary manner. And I should emphasize that the component that is allocated for those pool 2 costs is still a very substantial one. And over time, that will be reduced to 0. And awesome. We also discussed eventually starting to just create a tutorial to help community members that are currently helping to the sushi pool to slowly migrate to this curve pool. We will touch more on this later. For now, most of this liquidity is just protocol liquidity. So this means that the protocol is internalizing revenue directly with the strategies. And the time will come for this migration, and we will provide all the resources that are required for this. So there won't be any unanswered questions when it comes to the migration.
Great. Okay, I think that, let me just go through. I think that was our main list. Oh, one more thing just to layer on what Sterling was saying. So he was mentioning sort of the CRV CVX ability to make a curve V2 deployment that is actually net profitable to the protocol. So that's a really interesting way of getting away. We've talked a little bit on this call about how we're getting away from net inflationary mechanics across sort of Tokemak's mainline operations, but that shows how even in securing the protocol's own liquidity before we go really meta and have a Toka LP reactor within Tokemak, which will probably make people confused for a minute, and then they'll have a realization where there's Toka on both sides. It will mean that we can then be deploying liquidity profitably instead of in a net inflationary manner. So I think given that we got through most of the questions here, I guess we are probably over the scheduled time, but I think we can maybe throw it over to End and Degen Dan if there's any questions that we can field. Do a couple here at the end.
That was fantastic. Thanks so much for doing that. I don't think we have too many other questions. There was one question about LPs and sushi being able to move to the migration without recognizing IL. It's in the State of the Reactors chat by Macon, but I don't have an immediate answer for that. I don't know.
Yeah, that's.
Yeah, I mean, I think the question is like if someone were to pull their LP from sushi, right? They would be realizing their IL at this point in time. The answer to that is like, I'll have to look into this. Maybe there's like solutions to do this like really elegantly. But at a first glance, I would say the IL that you realize, like since the pricing should be the same on Curve and Sushi, right? If you just basically pull it out of Sushi and then plow it right into Curve, right? You would enter at the same price, right? Like so,
right.
You would like continue to ride that, so to speak, IL, right? Like you realize it, but like put it right back into a pool. So I'll have to think about this a little bit. Maybe there's like an elegant way to do this and to like really quantify it. But that would be like my initial kind of initial off the cuff answer to that.
Yeah, and I think that was something that came up when we were switching over from Uni to Sushi, and there was at least a tool to do that. I don't know if there are like, tax consequences to doing that, but I would imagine there's not a tool that's really simplistic way to do it, like switching from Uni to Sushi. But
we can definitely discuss internally more and share anything.
Oh yeah, actually, Reginald asked one question that I did want to see if you could address. There's been a lot of concern about. Did you mean Bancor? Bancor, yeah, you edited it. There we go.
Mm-hmm.
So the Bancor situation versus the Tokemak situation, I think maybe Carson or maybe you could take us through like just a high level understanding of how our reserves work, how during the recent market crash there was no Toka that was struck to mitigate IL, and how we've kind of taken a conservative approach, which ended up being a really smart thing for us to do. So
I'll start, and then Bruno or Sterling or anyone else on the team can chime in with some more thoughts here. So in general, it's an unfortunate sort of situation over at the Bancor side of things, because the I guess effective way you can describe their system, and this isn't how you would probably normally describe it, except for with sort of the hindsight of how this has been working, is that inflation is sort of covering inflation of the BNT token is sort of covering the losses there. And so that can get you into sort of an ugly spiral, which it sort of is right now, unfortunately, which means some of the LPs, and I forget which particular projects this would be on, but I think there's some right now where they were supposed to be completely protected single-sided, and I think they're maybe under 50% like underwater for ones that were supposed to have protection. And I think they have since sort of suspended the IL protection side. On Tokemak, we have a very different design. So how we approach this is we said, hey, we always need to have a reserve. We need to have sort of an at-risk pool, which is controlled and owned by the protocol. And then additionally, we can use a sort of leverage multiplier, which is really based on the volatility of assets. And that can be run in an extremely conservative or an extremely aggressive case, or anything in between. So for example, if you have 100 units of ABC token in the reserve, you might run things with a 0.1 turn of leverage, where you could only deploy 10 LP tokens from the LP side with ABC, knowing that we have 100 in the reserve, which is sort of like ridiculously overkill, right? But something that you can do in cases where you need sort of safety in the market. Conversely, you could have something where it's the exact opposite, where you use something like a 10x. So you have 100 units of ABC in the reserve, and you could say, cool, we can deploy 1,000 units of ABC from the LPs into the market. And so we have a ton of flexibility because of how we've set that up, with this concept of like, we can have a reserve that has a different size, and then we can have a multiple per each asset type that can be aggressive or conservative for what we deploy as liquidity. And that enables us to make sure that we deploy things in a safe manner. So pre the fall off, and then sort of post the fall off, we've gotten even more, I would say, risk off temporarily, and that will change when the market can support it. Anyone on the call want to chime in with more?
Yeah,
This kind of also, sorry. So I was just going to say that this kind of also explains why we took our time to scale that liquidity multiplier. So that risk perspective and the risk profile was one of the reasons.
And I just saw another question that I think is kind of funny, because we just talked about it last night, Carson. The question is like, what are your thoughts on using options and or other DeFi tools for hedging IL? Are these kinds of tool strategies in your mind for the future of Tokemak? So you probably have to say something about this, but like, we just talked like about exactly this last night. And currently, like in DeFi, like options they're just like, it's not economical. It's like they're very, very expensive, basically, right? The premiums on them. So at this point in time, like right now, it's not really like an efficient option. But like, yeah, Carson, you might have additional ideas.
So we'll probably be talking quite a bit more on this over the coming weeks and months, including with the community. So these are things that we actually want to have more like open discussions on, because there's some really interesting things that in theory you can do with options and futures. But when we were talking last night, we were sort of digging into this. We think that there is, if you think about the reserve system for a minute, and especially as we go into, I know probably a lot of people on the call aren't as deep on this part, but the reserve system that sort of the Tokemak V2 unlocks, where people can contribute into the reserve system, including the protocols that have various tokens. The protocols that care about the liquidity of ABC token, they can contribute ABC as an example. It's very much like you're basically hedging the market making activity, right? Another way to say like what IL is it's sort of the cost of being the market maker. Now, a normal market maker goes and hedges those things off somewhere else. Tokemak can go by deploying the liquidity and having those reserve pools move up and down in value. Those sort of pull in the risk of being the market maker, right? So there's interesting things you can do as options and derivatives more broadly sort of grow up in the space, and or I should say mature in the space, and where there's more access, where you could potentially allow more sophisticated players that can take the risk to plug into those things in addition to just filling up a reserve and letting those tokens go up and down. So it's definitely something we're exploring. I don't think it will be in sort of the next main launch of features, which we're calling V2 here, which includes the ACC token, a lot of the sustainable stuff. But it is something that at some point is going to make a lot of sense, probably at least as an option within this sort of broader Tokemak ecosystem. There's a lot you can do with that when the market is mature enough to be at the scale and the size of options liquidity that we would need it to be in order to hedge exposure as you're providing liquidity.
Cool. We're at 60 minutes, so I know some people on the call have some other calls to get to. So we're going to wrap this up, but I just want to thank Dan again for help spearheading this, and I want to thank the whole team for jumping on, and we're excited to keep doing these and keep everybody updated on the progress. And thanks to the audience for joining us, because there was, it's a bear market, but we got a nice little audience going. So
yeah, appreciate everyone joining, and we'll have another one in 2 weeks, and we can answer more questions.
Cool. All right, guys.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Alan.
Bye.
Awesome. Thank you. Talk to you soon, guys.